Well, good day to you. I think we can begin today. With us, we have a guest, Jim Alexander, and maybe the best description of Jim was somebody said that he was the fly in the Enron ointment, and we're going to say a little bit more about how he was in the Enron ointment and in what ways he functioned also as a fly. And try to draw out his experiences in that company as well then as in Spinnaker, a startup company which he started after that, which almost the two serve as kind of polar opposites of Jim's own experience in the business world. So we're delighted that Jim is with us. I think this is his second or third time part of this course, and again, he's always back on the popular demand. Thanks, Jim. And Jim is local here too, lives in New Haven. I need to remind all of you to use your microphones. And if I forget to remind you, would you please remind me to remind you to use the microphones? That would be great. Okay, so today we're talking about corporations and in particular relationship between faith traditions, and values and corporations. A larger setting in which we are making this discussion is the previous session where we talked about market as a whole. Well, we kind of did, right? In one section of the session we did, and the other section we immediately went toward a corporation and particular predicament in which a given corporation Cadbury had found itself. A wonderful discussion that we have had, led by Sharon Oster. So, and prior to that, our larger framework was a brief discussion about the character of faiths in the world today, secularization, desecularization with Casanova present as a resource person, and prior to after that, a section on globalization, both perils and promise of globalization. I think we more majored on the promise of globalization than on perils, but nonetheless, this is kind of a larger framework of what we have done so far. Just a brief reminder, why corporations? I think somewhere I have heard Doug Ray, who was a resource person for this class and who teaches at School of Management. He has said in the previous session that he's led on corporations, values and corporations, that about 80 to 90% of all wealth in capitalist economies is created by corporations, by limited liability corporations. Corporations then become a very powerful institutions in the world today, especially when one thinks about their multinational character. And key feature of corporations, and we'll explore some of that with Jim, is that owners essentially have a little way of controlling the business and even knowing what the business does, and therefore a certain separation of management from ownership, so that the managerial class, as a third in the kind of classical Marxian sense of classes, right, a class of workers, class of capitalists, but there is this managerial class which is quite distinct and extraordinarily powerful, and that presents itself with a host of significant ethical issues. Some of these we will explore as we talk with Jim about these issues. Now, what I want to do is just briefly sketch a role of faiths within possible roles of faiths within corporations, and then also kind of a place of people of faith within corporations. Those are two different sides of the same question. So how do corporations relate to faith traditions? That will be the first question. And that's a question that arises with the character of the globalized world, namely with emergence of religious pluralism. Suddenly, just like the states, so also corporations are religiously pluralistic spaces, and just like religious actors want to act as religious actors in the public space, so also they want to increasingly do that in the context of a corporation. Traditionally, within the business world, faith was considered just as in a kind of secular state as a private matter. You are a believer at home, and you're a believer in your church, mosque, synagogue, temple, whatever you go, in the private sphere of the community of faith, but not at the place of work. You should hang your faith on the coat rack, enter into workplace, and there function as a rational human being, as a kind of generic human being. And when you get off the work in your private sphere, you can be whatever you want to be. It's kind of, somebody has mentioned, discussion groups at least, so it was reported to me, that it was kind of don't ask, don't tell policy. Of course, people were people of faith, but you weren't supposed to be talking too much about this. And the reason why you weren't supposed to be talking too much about it, this is one, that your faith traditions have little to do with the business at hand, and two, is because if you bring up faith, faith is a divisive issue, especially issues like proselytism, kind of applying of the pressure on people to embrace faith, conditions in which only certain forms of faith are acceptable within the workplace, whole host of issues that have to deal with unequal treatment of various faiths within the corporation. You can see why people would want to minimize friction and therefore suppress the expressions of faith. And that was then, of course, analogous to how the place of faith within the state, right? There too, state was supposed to, at least in some accounts, be more secular, and people's faith commitments to be more private. It's difficult to have this, to sustain this strict division between private and public, and it's difficult to sustain it, I think, increasingly also within a corporation. Too, faith is shaping the way people act. And especially more people become kind of knowledge workers rather than assembly line kinds of workers. A place of faith, I think there's more space for the faith to insert itself. And people have, at least some people have started discovering, as we have seen in some of our readings, that faith can be an asset for business. You can harness the power of faith to serve the business purposes. Now, people of faith may have ambivalent position and feelings about this, but nonetheless, that also opens up the possibility of faith being present in within the corporation, expressions of faith being welcome. And I think that roughly my position there is very parallel to the position of the role of faith and the place of faith in liberal democracies. Liberal democracies ought to be impartial to all different expressions of faith, all overarching interpretations of life. All public spaces ought to be impartial to expressions of faith, and if they're not impartial, if they are either radically secular or if they're partial to a particular faith, they are not treating all their citizens equally. And so there's prima facie an argument, I think, for allowing of the expressions of faith within the corporation, but doing so on the equal basis, assuring impartiality. And of course, you'll have to monitor ways, procedures in which that's being done so that it isn't disruptive, just like you have to do that, the same thing in the context of in the political context. Okay, so, but what does the faith do in corporations? So okay, so you'll let it be there, but what might it do within that space of a corporation? And I think from the readings that we had for today, you could divide what faith might do or not do in terms of economic performance and in terms of moral framework that it brings. And the case that we have read is from Indonesia, Krakatau steel. I think it's a very interesting case study in a sense of insertion of translation in some ways of faith into a different mode and connecting it with the work of business. Faith first there was not understood as something that belongs to a private sphere, but rather something that should inform all spheres of life, private and communal, spheres, of course, but also what people do in everyday life. And then two major moves, as you will recall. One was connection between work and calling, or work and worship. Your own worship is not limited to what you do in your privacy of your home or in the temple. Worship is what you do in the everyday life. That kind of a line you can see in Christianity, you can see it in Judaism, you can see it also in Islam, so that the worship permeates all of your life, therefore also what you do when you are at a place of work. And the consequence of that is a certain form of discipline, right? A certain form of responsibility to do the job as doing it as a religious duty. And the line that's there, or sometimes it's that is used, is faith as being done for God. You work for God as you work for your earthly employees. Now, you can see how that might be easily misused, right? My earthly employee is not God, right? There's a distinction between the two, and there's going to be a tension between the claims of God on you and claims of the concrete space in which you find yourself. And I think that's going to be an interesting question to pursue, of course. And then the other side of it was, so one was faith or work as worship, and the other one was accountability. A sense that you don't need to be monitored from outside, but that you can be, because you do your work before God and for God, you can be counted on that you will do your work honestly, responsibly, and so forth. And we'll address some of these issues as we explore with Jim, as we explore what does it take to do honest work in the context of a corporation, kind of ethical framework and knowledge of what is right. The piece that we read on there suggests, most people actually know what's right. So the problem is not so much knowing what is right, but being somehow having ability in the context in which you find yourself to do what is right. Now, what we'll explore with Jim is what is the context, and what are the pressures of that particular context that push you not quite to do what is right, and how can resistances be made to the pressure to do what might not quite be morally right. So now, in this case that we've read, the presupposition almost seems to be that if you employ properly your faith, it's going to enhance economic performance, and faith is somehow going to add to the value. It's going to be kind of value added. It's going to add to the creation of value. But the question then from the internal question of faith becomes, well, who defines what value is? And if I read this piece rightly, it seems that the value is being defined as any corporation might define it, as maximizing profit. But is that acceptable from the perspective of faith? And the question might not be, well, should faiths affirm profitability? Because a lot of faiths, at least these days, think that profits as such is not a problem. But it's a problem if that's the sole and the most important issue. Yesterday, we've had discussion, case study. We were looked at the center that I run, and there are about 23 case studies that are now being done, but various companies from all across the world which are in some ways shaped by religious sensibilities, or leadership has been shaped by religious sensibilities and imbued that into the work of the corporation. One of these such was Chick-fil-A. And the first one that we've looked at, case studies now virtually finished, and the significant factor there is, well, they closed their shop on Sundays, right? That's Lord's Day is being honored there, and somehow that translates into improved economic performance. And one of the topics of our discussion was, well, is that what we should be simply concerned about? How about the fate? How about what happens to how much the employees are being paid? Or would the added value be if you could hire and keep hired 1,000 employees, but your profits will be reduced to about 1 cent above the failure, going into red, right? What is the value? And I think the faith traditions will ask the questions of the character of values, and generally it would not sit so well with them if it's defined simply in terms of profitability, in terms of maximizing profit. We'll talk with Jim about that as well when we come to Spinnaker. So we'll draw most of this stuff that we're discussing now out of Jim and out of concrete experience of him running those various businesses. And then I think what faiths also bring, and I'll be relatively brief, is, and we've talked about that already before, is kind of moral judgments about work that's being done. Now, when I say moral judgments, I think some of you might scratch your heads and say, who needs moralizing faiths, right? Who needs faiths to tell me what is morally acceptable or not? For folks who embrace faiths, certain faiths tend to do that, and most people think that if faiths don't, in some way, help you read the world in moral terms, that they're not doing their job properly. You recall what I've said, that faiths can be reduced to kind of performance-enhancing drugs, right? It can be kind of upper as a performance-enhancing drug and a soothing drug. And this was a major critique, right? Marxian critique, if you recall Marxian critique of religion, religion is opiate of the people. Major critique was the only function that the religion have is kind of to soothe the sentiments of people, have them dream about the world to come so that they cannot bother too much the processes as they're going on in the world as it is today. Kind of privatize it completely, make it otherworldly so that it doesn't have a bite in the world today. Now, but if faiths do have bite in the world today, then of course the question arises, well, do we like what faiths demand, the justice, kind of ways in which faiths understand justice? So you have faiths often then oscillating between withdrawal or kind of what I call sometimes idleness of faith. If they try to shape the world, as I think major prophetic religions are all structurally built to do. Judaism, Christianity, Islam are prophetic religions. Right? And in that sense, the prophet receives kind of a message from God in order to apply it to the world. But if faiths do that, suddenly many people experience that as a kind of inappropriate insertion, as violence. And if faiths withdraw, then they become subject to kind of Marxian critique that they're idle. They're doing basically nothing. They kind of soothe private consciousness of people, help them in their everyday life, but actually have no significant impact on the world as it's being lived. And so you have faiths often oscillating between insertion, sometimes maybe inappropriate insertion, and then withdrawal. And the question, I think, for faith tradition is always, well, how does one find ways in which to insert oneself in an appropriate way in the pluralistic context? And that's what creates that's where the rubber hits the road. We have a pluralistic context of people who do not necessarily agree with each other. So at any rate, there is moral judgments which faiths make, and those moral judgments concern both how the work should be done and also what should be done. You know, there is a distinction in the Christian tradition, at least, but other tradition as well, when it comes to the just war. When is it just to engage in war? And you have a distinction between jus in bello, justice in the conduct of the war, and jus ad bellum, just cause for engaging in war. Like action. I think something similar can be said also about economic activity, indeed about most of the spheres. You can ask the question, well, what is just in terms of conduct of business, right? How you treat workers, whatever else that might be, and or what kind of activities, what kind of business products, outcomes are just and worthy of being pursued. And sometimes the question is not simply also what's right or wrong. Sometimes I think that the question is what might be morally excellent. And morally excellent,
that's a different issue.
It's a different issue, but it's an important issue. For instance, you might say, okay, I was one day. I hope I didn't tell the story here. I was on a cruise a few years ago, black tie, dinner reception, and I'm with a guy, and I'm asking what's he doing, and so he tells me, well, you will laugh, Miroslav. And I said, well, try me, and he said, I'm making urinals. And I paused a little bit and said, well, most of us men need them, so it's okay, it's gonna go. And he said, I'm in the business of making flush-free urinals. Now, that's an excellent work, right? It's not, if he was making regular urinals, he could have done a very nice job making regular urinals. It would have been just completely appropriate, ethically praiseworthy kind of work that he was doing. But instead, he was doing something, I think, which was morally excellent, right? He was attending to the needs of the planet, right, as he was pursuing his business. And so the question becomes not only what's allowed or not allowed, but what might be excellent. And I think we might think in terms of how to stimulate our imagination to think of ways in which, without sacrificing necessarily profit, what might attend not only to people, but also to planet. Kind of triple bottom line, as people sometimes talk, right? And a certain form of excellence is required in order to do that. And I think excellence that's required can be stimulated by a variety of sources. It can come from a variety of sources, but certainly faith traditions can contribute to that, to the extent that faith traditions talk about what it means to flourish as a human being, and to the extent that they talk about what it means to pursue global common good in the context of a grand vision of human flourishing, as well as of the global common good. We might want to pursue the question of what is excellent. Of course, excellent will always be in the context of what's doable, right? But nonetheless, the excellent question is a significant question to address. What also is sometimes suggested is that the faith traditions are able to do is not simply suggest what ought to be done, right, but provide a certain motivation to be able to do that. That may be a disputed claim, but at least one has to understand that from internal self-perception of faiths are not simply ethical systems. They're ethical systems with built-in motivations as to why what is being required ought to be done. And if it's true that most of us roughly know what's to be done, but when we come into a critical situation, we're not sure that it's worth doing it, or we're not sure that we have enough strength to do it, then religious traditions might be of some help in this regard. Critical situations as such arise, I think, constantly, not just in the business, they arise constantly in everyday kind of alive compromises that we have to make, and difficulties in making judgments, not just making judgments, but then going through with those judgments. In that regard, I think we might think about the role that religious traditions play. And hence, we often, a colleague of mine is working on kind of applying virtue ethic to the question of business. It's not just teaching rules, but nurturing the types of people that are able, in concrete situation, to act in accordance with those rules. That kind of raises the question whether the whole industry of business ethics is that significant of an endeavor? Now, there'll be the last person to try to speak against business ethics, but to the extent that the discussion is simply about what is right or what is wrong, or at least to simply raise this question of right and wrong, we may not be doing enough. We may be soothing our conscience that we are doing something, but in fact may be doing too little because we are not nurturing the types of people who are able to act in concrete situations as one ought to act. Now, a cynic might say, if you haven't learned that by year 10, you probably are not going to learn it anytime after that. You know, that's what happens way back at home. But whatever the area, I think it's important to keep in mind the importance of the virtue in this context. And that, of course, doesn't at all mean that regulation is unnecessary, or that even thinking about how the work environment itself is structured doesn't have a moral implications. And I think, especially as we think about corporation, I hope that with Jim we can explore in what ways the very nature of the setup called corporation militates against the ability to act in morally responsible ways, so that the form of corporation itself is an ethical issue. Regulation, of course, but the form of the corporation itself. Now, I think I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to go with these few challenges that we have here about how to act morally responsible ways within the corporation. I'll go straight in discussion with Jim, and then we'll take a break and have a more broader conversation.